Welcome to IGCSE Bob. This is part 2 to the first podcast, Origins of the Cold War, and we will continue right here. So we were talking about history, and we stopped at the Iron Curtain. So let's continue. So Stalin tightened his control, with communist governments established throughout Eastern Europe. Stalin gradually tightened his control in each country. The secret police imprisoned anyone who opposed the communist rule or might oppose it at a later date. In October 1947, Stalin set up a Communist Information Bureau, or Cominform, to coordinate the work of communist parties of Eastern Europe. Cominform regularly brought the leaders of each communist party to Moscow to be briefed by Stalin's ministers. This also allowed Stalin to keep close eye on them. He spotted independent-minded leaders and replaced them with people who were completely loyal to him. The only communist leaders who escaped this close control was Tito in Yugoslavia. He resented being controlled by Cominform and was expelled of his hostility in 1948. The Cold War. It was clear by 1946 that the wartime friendship between allies had broken down. It had been replaced by suspicion and accusation. However, the distrust between the USA and the USSR was soon so great that leaders were talking in public about the threats of the war between the two countries. Instead of running down arms expenditure after the war, as you expected them, the two sides actually increased their stock of weapons. Each side took every opportunity to denounce the policies or plans of the other. A propaganda war was developed. In this atmosphere of tension and recrimination, people began to talk about the Cold War. This Cold War was going on for the last 30 years and would dominate relationships between the countries for much of that time. Why was USA worried about communism? Roosevelt and Stalin had got on surprisingly well as individuals, but the wartime alliance with the USSR and the USA had always been unlikely friendship. It was really only the war that held the alliance together. The USA and the USSR had little in common as countries, as the leaders had different beliefs and ideas. Before the war, they trusted each other very greatly. Many Soviets still remembered that the US troops had been sent in to fight communism in Russia's civil war. As for the Americans, opinion polls before the war in the USA showed that Americans trusted communists less than the Nazis. The USA had been appalled when Stalin signed his pact with Hitler in 1937. Even during the war, the Americans had not really supported Stalin's war effort as he wished. He had not sent troops to help him to hold back Hitler in the Soviet Union. So let's compare about the USA and the USSR. The USA is a democracy. Its government was chosen in free democratic elections. USSR was a communist state. It was a one-party dictatorship. Elections were held, but all candidates belonged to the Communist Party. USA was the world's wealthiest country, but as in most capitalist countries, there were extremes. Some were great wealth, and some were great poverty as well. In USSR, there was an economic superpower because its industry had grown so rapidly between the 1920s and the 1930s. But the general standard of living in USSR was much lower in the USA. Even so, unemployment was rare and extreme poverty was rarer than in the USA. For Americans, being free of control by the governments was more important than everyone being equal. Americans firmly believed that the other country should be run in the American way. Many Americans bitterly opposed communism. For communists, the rights of individuals were seen as less important than the good of society as a whole. So individuals' lives were tightly controlled. Soviet leaders were believed that other countries should be run in the communist way. Many people in the USSR were bitterly opposed to capitalism. So let's summarize. USSR was communist. It had communist elections. Its industry was state-owned, and and the individual rights meant everyone had the same things given. For the USSR, USA was capitalist and democratic. So for elections, they could choose Republican or Democrats, and for industry, they could choose privates. It's privates, and for individual rights, I believe that everyone had chances that they could take. Um, the Americans believed in the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom of wants, and freedom of fear. So the differing beliefs in USA and the USSR got some way in explaining why the Cold War developed, but not all the way. After all, they had different beliefs in the 1920s and the 1930s, and they had not answered the Cold War. However, there were some important differences between the 1930s and the 1940s. The USA and the USSR emerged from the war as two superpowers. In the 1930s, other countries such as Britain and France had been important in international affairs. However, the war finally demoted Britain and France into a second division. They were not big enough, rich enough, or strong enough to exercise real international leadership. Only the USA and the USSR were able to do this. They were the superpowers. The USA was really aware that a responsibility was attached to being a superpower. In the 1930s, the USA had followed a policy of isolation, keeping European and world affairs out. The Americans had been disapproved of the Soviet communism, but tried not to get involved. However, in the 1940s, the USA had learned a lesson. They did not want to repeat mistakes that had made before in the Second World War. Roosevelt had set the Americans firmly against a policy of isolation. In March 1945, he said to the American Congress that Americans will have to take the responsibility for world collaboration, or we shall have to bear the responsibilities for another world conflict. There were no more appeasements of dictators. From now on, every communist action would meet an American reaction. The reaction of the West. The American superpowers were alarmed by Stalin's takeover of Eastern Europe. Roosevelt, Churchill, and the successors had accepted that Soviet security needed friendly governments in Eastern Europe. They had agreed that Eastern Europe would be a Soviet sphere of influence, and that Stalin would heavily influence this region. However, they had not expected such complete communist domination. They felt it should have been possible to have governments in Eastern Europe that were both democratic and friendly to the USSR. Stalin saw his policy in Eastern Europe as making himself secure, but Truman could only see the spread of communism. By 1948, Greece and Czechoslovakia were the only Eastern European countries not controlled by communist governments. It seemed that the Americans were not only Greece and Czechoslovakia, but even Italy and France were vulnerable to communist takeover. Events in these two countries were to have a decisive effect on American policy towards Europe. Greece. When the Germans retreated from Greece in 1944, there were two rival groups, the monarchies, the non-governments, and the communists, who wanted to rule the country. Both had been involved in the resistance against the Nazis. The communists wanted Greece to be a Soviet republic. The monarchies wanted the return of the King of Greece. Churchill sent British troops to Greece in 1945 supposedly to restore order and supervise free elections. In fact, the British supported the monarchies, and the king returned to power. In 1946, the USSR protested to the United Nations that the British troops were a threat to peace in Greece. The United Nations took no actions, so the communists tried to take over control in Greece by force. A civil war quickly developed. The British couldn't afford to such cost of war and announced on February 1947 that they were withdrawing their troops. Truman stepped in, paid for the Americans, and sent British troops to stay in Greece. They tried to prop up King's government. By 1950, the Royalists were in control of Greece, although they were very weak governments, always in crisis. The Truman Doctrine. American intervention in Greece marked a new era in USSR's attitude to world politics, which became known as the Truman Doctrine. Under the Truman Doctrine, the USA was prepared to spend money, equipment, and advice to any country that was, in Americans' view, threatened by a communist takeover. Truman accepted that Eastern Europe was now communist. His aim was to stop communism from spreading any further. This policy became known as containment. Others thought containment should mean something firmer. He thought that it should be made clear that the Soviet Union, that expansion beyond a given limit should be met with military force. Marshall Aid. Truman believed that communism succeeded with people facing poverty and hardship. He sent the American General George Marshall to assess the economic state of Europe. What he found was a ruined economy. The countries of Europe owed $11.5 billion to the USA. There were extreme shortages of all foods. All countries were still rationing bread. There was such a coal shortage in the hard winter in 1947 that in Britain all electricity was turned off for a period each day. Churchill described Europe as a rubble heap, a breeding ground of hate. Marshall suggested about 17 billion would be needed to rebuild European prosperity. In December 1947, Truman put his plans on Congress. For a short time, the American Congress refused to grant this money. Many Americans would become concerned about Truman's involvement in foreign affairs. Besides, it was a lot of money. Czechoslovakia. Americans' attitude changed when the communists took over the government of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia had been ruled by a government which included the communists, had been trying to pursue policies independent of Moscow. The communists came down hard in March 1948. Anti-Soviet leaders were purged. One pro-American minister, Jan Musk, was found dead below his open window. The communists said that he had jumped. The Americans suspected that he had been pushed. Immediately, the Congress accepted the Marshall Plan and made $17 billion available over the next 4 years. On one hand, the Marshall aid was extremely generous by the American people. On the other hand, it also motivated by American self-interest. It wanted to create new markets for American goods. Americans remembered the disastrous effects of the European in the 1930s. Truman wanted to do all he could to prevent another worldwide slump. Stalin viewed Marshall aid with suspicion. After expressing some initial interest, he refused to have anything more to do with it. He also forbade any of the Eastern Europe states to apply for the Marshall aid. Stalin's views that the anti-communist aims behind the Marshall Plans was to weaken his hold on Eastern Europe. He also felt that USA was trying to dominate as many states as possible by making them dependent on dollars. So this is part 2 of the origins of the Cold War. In part 3, I will talk about the Soviet blockade on Berlin, the Berlin blockade. So if you want to know more, click on part 3. And this is IGCSE Bob signing off.